professor of political science. And I'm going to get the panel started. I have 4 or 5 questions to ask the panelists, and then we're going to open it up to questions for anybody that is here in the webinar. But my first question is just to ask you each to talk a little bit about your background and your sort of where you come from in your area of knowledge, and why you're here talking to us tonight about the Ukraine and Russia.
Should I start?
Yeah, go ahead.
So, hi everyone. Thanks, Nick, for hosting tonight's panel. I think this is really important to spread the awareness as to everything that is going on in Ukraine. I am originally from Ukraine. Right now, I'm Ukrainian American because I received my American citizenship last year. But I was born in Ukraine and lived there till I was 19 years old. And when I was 19, there was an exchange program with Lock Haven University. So I decided to go and study in Lock Haven for a semester. And then I just decided to transfer. So I finished Lock Haven University. And while in Lock Haven, I got fascinated with economics. And I went further on to get my PhD in Clemson University in economics. And after that, I decided to become a professor. And that's how I ended up being assistant professor at Susquehanna University. As I mentioned, I am Ukrainian. And most of my family lives in Ukraine right now. The only person that doesn't live in Ukraine is my mom. But my father, my aunts, my cousins, everybody lives there. So I'm the only one who is living in the United States from our family. So of course, they have been tremendously impacted by the events that are going on in Ukraine right now. So I decided to become part of this panel to, share the experiences of my parents, as well as share the experiences of my friends who right now are in different cities of Ukraine, including the eastern part of Ukraine, cities in the west of Ukraine, basically all over the Ukraine. So I just wanted to kind of share what I know, talking to people on the ground, share the things that I know about Ukraine and our culture, and how the current situation can potentially evolve, based on my opinion, based on my own experience. Andrea, you wanna?
Sure. I'm Andrea Lopez, as Nick said. I am here largely because of my academic expertise, I guess you could call it expertise. I started out as a Soviet studies major in college, and my senior year, the Soviet Union fell apart. But I went on and continued to get a master's in Russian and Eastern European studies. With a focus on political science, Russian foreign policy, military policy, and then shifted at Michigan into international security studies. And so I do international relations, foreign policy, and my primary research focus is really on counterinsurgency and war. So, this unfortunately brings together my 2 academic fields pretty clearly. And so I am here for that purpose. And that and Nick asked me, so of course I said yes. So yeah, that's why I'm here.
Thank you both. I'll start with our first question, which is, how have we arrived in this situation? What are the reasons that you both see that you think have led us to this conflict?
I think, just from my understanding of history and things that have been going on, Putin, he wants to rebuild the former Soviet Union. He is really, upset that things fell apart back in 1990s. And he, by invading Ukraine, he wants to reclaim our territory. And also think that he hates Ukrainians because, Ukrainians are not Russians and Ukrainians are not Belarusians. In Russia, Belarusian people are okay with having a leader for years. So if you think about Putin, he's been in power for over 20 years. Lukashenko has been in power for, I think also over 20 years. In Ukraine, we changed our leaders every 4 years. So since 1990s, we had President Kuchma, and then we had President Poroshenko. Well, I don't remember in exact chronological order, but it was Poroshenko, Yanukovych. There was our current president Zelensky. So I think we changed 4 or 5 presidents during the time period that Russia still only has Putin and Lukashenko in power. So since we're a democratic country, sovereign country, and we are positioning ourselves with the West, We don't want to have anything to do with Russia. And this poses a threat to Putin, and he perceives us as a threat, even though we are not. So I feel like he hates us for being a democratic country and for respecting the rule of law and wanting to be independent and wanting not to have anything to do with Russia. So back in 2013, the end of 2013, 2014, Ukrainian people expressed the desire to become part of European Union. And at that point in time, our president was Viktor Yanukovych, who was a very close friend of Vladimir Putin. And Yanukovych did not want to respect people's position towards Europe. He wanted us to be very close and friendly with Russia. So people started protesting. They started coming out on the streets in Kiev. So he prohibited protests. He basically used the same rules that Putin is using right now in Russia. And he said, if you come and protest, you're going to go to jail. And people got even angrier. More people came to the streets of Kiev, and the protests lasted for 90 days. And they ended up with people actually ousting our president, who ran to Russia in the middle of the day, in the middle of the night. He packed his money, his cash, his cars, his helicopters, and he just ran away. And Putin cannot take this. You know, how is that possible that a country right next to Russia is exercising its freedoms, exercising its democratic rights, and trying to become part of EU? Because this is something that cannot happen in Russia, and this is something that cannot happen in Belarus. So I feel like he's punishing us for trying to be a democratic country and leaning west. He's just at this point, I feel like he's getting crazier and crazier, and is digging in more. The more we fight, the more he's digging in and trying to suppress us. So Ukraine has been historically fighting against Russia for many centuries, especially the west of Ukraine, which is very patriotic and very nationalistic. And that really bothers him. So I feel like he wants to reclaim Ukraine because he always believed that we were part of Russia. He calls us small Russians. They call us brothers, but we are not. The little sister, Ukraine is the little sister of Russia. So he kind of created that narrative that, we need to be kind of, taken back to Russia because, of our democratic tendencies, because of us leaning towards European Union. And that's kind of, I think what he's thinking about. The narrative that he's spreading in Russia is different. He is spreading the narrative that because we want to be part of EU and, we want to be close to the United States, by doing that, we can potentially become a NATO country, which would threaten Russia for some reason. There is also a narrative going on that Ukraine is developing nuclear weapons, which is completely untrue. Of course, there is a narrative that we are oppressing Russians, that there is a genocide against Russian people in Ukraine, which is absolutely untrue. And he's just kind of spreading this misinformation for the last 10 years. And people, unfortunately, in Russia, many people believe, many people don't, but many people do believe that. And from my personal conversations with Russians, they're telling me stories that are just appalling. They're telling me that our own army is attacking us. Our own Ukrainian army is killing Ukrainian children. And the Russians are coming to liberate us. And they're coming to denazify us because we are Nazis. So the things that are coming out from Russian media are just really hard for me to watch because I get really upset and angry. I can't listen to that. When I talk to my Russian relatives, they're just saying, well, but that's what they show on TV. I said, but that's not true. And, it's really hard to convince them just because of the years of misinformation. So sorry, my answer was a little bit going into different directions. I couldn't really concentrate on one specific direction. But I think just because he doesn't like Ukrainian people, he thinks we are a threat because, what if Russians decide to do the same thing? What if they decide to, uproot him? What if they decide to be a democratic nation? He doesn't want that. And he's afraid of Ukrainians.
Thank you. Dr. Lopez?
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit to that. I mean, I agree with everything that you just said. I guess a couple of things I would add to the context is that, it's not just it is obviously he's focusing on Ukraine, no question, but it is the broader threat, I think, that Russia has felt from first these democratic revolutions, what were called the color revolution. So you have that 2004, the Orange Revolution in Russia, followed by Maidan, Euromaidan in 2014. You have the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan. You had the Rose Revolution in Georgia. And so you have all of these kind of pro-democratic movements that, if you're an increasingly autocratic leader, does seem to pose a threat. And then you have the NATO expansion that occurred primarily in the late 1990s and early 2000s that, the Russians that just, I think you could say, fed on the traditional Russian fear and concern of encirclement, that the Russians have long perceived them as being surrounded by enemies. You've had examples of the Mongols and the French and the Germans a couple of times invading. And so this just fed into a lot of that view. Two other points I would just add to this really quickly was that, there is this I said two other points. I might just only have one, but there was this sense that, Russia during the 1990s was really humiliated. And, there was at one point, Putin said he had driven a cab, in the early 1990s, which is actually pretty understandable given how poor the Russian government was and how unable it was to feed its population. So you have this feeling that we were humiliated, the West took advantage of us when we were weak, and now we're no longer weak. And linked to that is this kind of view that, the West is weakening, and that you have this weakening of democracy, whether it be in places like Hungary and Poland, or whether it be among individual groups like the National Front in France, who have leaned toward Putin. Rhetoric from the United States under President Trump about, being less supportive of NATO, less supportive of a lot of the democratic ideals that we had called for. May have made this seem like a perfect time to carry out that deeper desire that Putin has and has voiced for, well over a decade, to reincorporate Ukraine into a Russian-led system.
Thank you both. My second question for you is that, so far as you know, what is the experience on the ground in the Ukraine right now? How is the conflict going, and how are Ukrainians coping with the conflict?
So I'll just tell you what I know from my personal experience, because my father's in Ukraine and my two aunts and the rest of my family. So most of them are in the western part of Ukraine, which is very close to Romanian border, maybe about 2 or 3 hours away. If you guys are watching, CNN or Fox News, sometimes they're reporting from Kiev, not of course from Kiev, but they're reporting from a city of Lviv, and Lviv is one of the largest Western cities. So my hometown is just a couple of hours north from Lviv. It's called Kolomea, and it's close to another big city, Ivano-Frankivsk. So within that immediate area, things are quiet. The sirens are going off every day. We are not sure why, but there is for some reason sirens in the middle of the night. Some people rush to the basements, but at this point, my dad said, well, nothing has been happening, so I'm just going to stay home for now. What is happening, though, refugees are coming nonstop. The trains of refugees from Kiev just flock to the western part of Ukraine, my hometown, Lviv, Ivano-Frankivsk. Many of the refugees stay in my town and the bigger cities, but many choose to move further to Poland and Romania, Moldova, wherever they can cross. In the eastern part of Ukraine, things are very dire, very difficult. I have my former classmate, he's from Irpin, which is right next to Kiev. And he said that everything is leveled to the ground there, like everything. You guys might have seen some shots of the bridge where the Ukrainian soldiers were trying to evacuate people. So that's where he lived. My classmate, he lives in the city of Chernihiv. And he's on this group chat with my other friends. So we kind of check in on him every day to see how things are going. And he's saying, they're shooting from all the directions, missiles, bombs coming off everywhere. the airplanes flying, back and forth. It's hard to say who is shooting, but they're being encircled by Russians. There's no way to leave the town. So some parts of the city have already lost electricity. He's trying to stay safe. He's helping the soldiers by doing little things. He's not fighting actively, but he's, helping with little things. But so far, he's staying brave, and, the rest of the people are just very determined to fight. I have some people in Sumy, and they are being evacuated right now. But it's very hard to leave just because, Russians are saying they're going to stop and do the ceasefire, but they, keep shooting at Red Cross or people trying to get evacuated. I have some people in Mykolaiv, another city that is being encircled by Russians. And those people, these are my best friends' cousins. They're not able to leave. They're just staying in their apartment in the basement for days now. They're afraid to get out of the house. There's no way for them to get out. And my cousin, he lives in Dnipropetrovsk, which is also in the east of Ukraine, with his family and his little daughter, and the same thing. We are asking him, can you come to the western part? You can, stay with us. We can shelter you. And he says there is no way, because the trains are not going out of the city. If you want to just use your private vehicle, they can shoot at you. So there is no guarantee that you'll make out of there. So things have been really dire in the east. Russians have been shooting at residential areas, because in Ukraine, we have in the United States, a lot of people live in their own houses, but in Ukraine, we live in apartment complexes, maybe like 9 stories. I think the highest would be like 12, 15 stories high. And the Russians just shooting indiscriminately at the apartment complexes. They're hitting schools, hospitals. You guys have seen maybe in the news yesterday that they hit the hospital, children's hospital and maternity ward in Mariupol. So they're just shooting indiscriminately. They're using the cluster bombs. They have no respect for human life. So, things are pretty dire, I would say. And unfortunately, many people cannot get out from the eastern part. I kind of feel bad that my family, in a way, feel guilty that my family is safe for now, but I don't know for how long they're going to be safe. I talked to my dad today, and many people in the West are thinking that maybe he's leaving us for last, just because, I don't know, he really dislikes the Western Ukraine. Western Ukraine historically has been slightly different from the East, even though when I was growing up, there was no distinction, East or West. But Western is very patriotic, democratic. We are very pro-Western. We speak Ukrainian. We respect our traditions, history, and we don't want to do anything with Russia. We are ethnic Ukrainians. So he really dislikes us. And I'm really worried that, once he's done with the East, he'll just come after us, and not with the boots on the ground, because, Western Ukrainians would not ever allow for that. People will come out with guns and they will just stop the invaders. There's no way he can take us just by coming into our homes. But what he can do, he can just send a couple of missiles from Belarus. He can, throw bombs. And that's what, people in the West are afraid of. He did shot a couple of airports around my hometown. One was in Ivano-Frankivsk and one in the surroundings of my town. And I think primarily just to disable any military bases. We do have a military base in my hometown. And, again, whenever there's a military base, there is a fear that he's going to target the military base. So far, things have been, quiet, and the Western part is just focusing on the efforts to help people from the East and to help the army, help the refugees, and, do whatever we can to help the rest of Ukraine.
Just militarily, I will say, I think the view is that Russia has managed to get much less far than expected at this point. The expectation was that, Kyiv could fall in just a few days, that much of the east would fall relatively quickly. The and this is probably due to a variety of things. Some of it is absolutely that Ukrainians are fighting much harder than anybody, and I think particularly the Russians, who I think bought into their own propaganda, expected. Number two, the Russians are conducting military operations kind of stupidly, and that is beneficial to trying to slow them down. And so I think, what we've seen is that they are engaging in the same kind of military strikes that they did in Chechnya, that they did in Syria, which is, as Lyuda said, just, very little regard for civilian life, for human life generally. This just basically attempt to flatten, particularly more urban areas, to make it easier to take. And so if you terrorize and kill everyone, there's not a whole lot that you need to then do. And so you do have the use of, cluster munitions, the reported use of vacuum bombs, a variety of other horrific, even more horrific than normal weapons, tools. And so you do have this targeting of civilian areas. The concern, of course, is that you do have cities, Mariupol, Kharkiv in the east, that are increasingly surrounded, and that the Russians may be able to take them and then start driving westward. And could perhaps, I saw one report today that suggested maybe, that Kiev could fall, perhaps only has about 2 weeks of food and supplies, so could fall in about a month, as they just, the population has nothing to eat or drink or fight with. And so there is still this significant possibility that Russia could keep moving east. It is taking higher and higher costs. It has lost at least 2 fairly high-level generals, so not just 1-star, but 2- and 3-star generals. And, so there are significant costs, but they are still far stronger than Ukraine is.
Yeah, their sheer size is astounding. Ukraine is we have only 44 million people. Russia has 144 million people. Their army is 5 times larger in comparison to Ukrainian army. I feel like over the last couple of years, since the start of the Soviet Union, Ukrainian army has been very much depleted, mostly because of corruption. I mean, corruption in Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, it's still there, maybe less so in Ukraine, but it's just persistent. So the funds were not used appropriately to support Ukrainian army. And I feel the same thing about Russia, because I'm looking at some of the videos posted by soldiers, and they're having like old tanks, old ammunition. So, I'm presuming their army is in the same shape or in a similar shape as our army. So it's not very well advanced, but they are 5 times larger than we are in terms of their army size. And they can keep drawing people in. My dad was saying that there are some, talks or some rumors they're just going to start drafting people in Russia because, once they run out of their soldiers in the ground, they'll just need to recruit more and more people. And there are just so many people in Russia that just keep recruiting more soldiers. There is a general military draft in Ukraine. So all the men between 18 and 60 can be called to war. And my dad is only 56, so he technically will have to serve if he is called. But the same thing in Russia, if he needs more people to fight, he will just keep increasing the size of his army.
I think politically for Putin, in that case, the challenge might be that he is right now claiming, it's not true, but he's claiming that no conscripts are being used. And so if he starts engaging in a draft, that is an immediate signal to the country, to the populace, that this war is going horrifically for them. And right now, and I saw one of the questions in chat, or one of the questions posted, was that, you've had the departure of over 300 Western Russian media, is that this was an attack, an economic attack by the West, that Russia was only, engaging in its special military operation to defend the Russians, the Donetsk and Luhansk area of Ukraine, and to get rid of the Nazis who were running the state. And so I think, Putin's ability to shape that message would fall apart immediately if he starts drafting. Does that mean he won't? Not necessarily, but I think, the ability to pretend that this is still a limited operation would disappear.
Right, and just to kind of, follow up on that, he's refusing to admit that Russian soldiers are dying in Ukraine. Right now, according to official Ukrainian channels, there are close to 12,000 soldiers that have been already killed. He's saying there are no casualties, maybe, 100 or something, a couple of hundred. They're refusing to take their bodies. So we already contacted the Red Cross and said, we need these bodies out of the country, take your soldiers away, dead soldiers away. They're refusing. They don't admit that there are any dead soldiers in Ukraine, which is of course a lie, because he's afraid, he doesn't want his Russian population to know that soldiers are dying. But Ukraine has created a special hotline for mothers of Russian soldiers, and they're calling in and crying, inquiring, where's my son? Do you know anything? Because he said he's going to Kyiv. So there is, some awareness that soldiers are dying, but, he's just trying to hide it.
You're muted, Nick.
Sorry about that. I'm going to ask my last question so we can then get to some of the audience's questions. But how do you think this conflict might end? I know that's something that's on a lot of minds right now, and obviously it's difficult to anticipate, and there's a lot of potential scenarios. But I'm curious where each of you think this might be heading ultimately.
Ooh, I don't know. I don't see any good outcome. I think probably, the ideal outcome at this stage would be that Putin realizes that this is a war that is not going to be easily won, and that he's not going to be able to hold Ukraine for that same patriotism and nationalism that Lyudmyla mentioned. You're going to get a long-term insurgency. And this is a country significantly larger than Afghanistan. This is a country who has more than about a third more people than either Afghanistan or Iraq. And so, you can kind of think of how much trouble the United States had holding those two areas, and that, it's going to be much harder for Russia to hold. And so, the best ideas, the best outcome would be that Putin realizes that this is unwinnable, claims some limited victory, and withdraws. I don't think that's going to happen. I think he's going to double down, as he has been, and continue this war. And so I expect it to get far worse for the Ukrainian population, and for those, poor, Russian kids who were sent into combat. And, I think it might drag on for a long time.
Yeah, unfortunately, I have a very similar opinion. I was trying to talk to my dad today and just asking, him, like, what do you think? Like, what are people talking around? Like, what are you hearing? What are they saying? And, well, nobody knows anything, and they're hoping for the best. But, unfortunately, I have the same opinion that he's just going to, drag this out because he just has so many people in Russia and, such big military force. And he'll just keep advancing, and, we'll keep fighting back, and he'll keep advancing back and forth, back and forth. So this is my greatest fear, that this is just going to keep going and people will become numb to it. Because right now you see news on CNN or Fox News, it's everywhere. But at some point, the news coverage will start shifting to something else, Supreme Court, or, something else in the United States or in the world. And I'm afraid that we'll get forgotten. And this will just, keep going on and on. So when he started to finance the insurgency in Donetsk and Luhansk, initially it initiated back in 2014. So right now it's been going on for years, right? I would call my dad every couple of, days and say, hey, how's the war going? Is it still going? He's like, yeah, it's going. Soldiers are dying, they're sending back dead soldiers. So this has been dragging for years. So I'm afraid that, it might be a similar situation where we'll just keep fighting back and he'll keep advancing, fighting back and he'll keep advancing. I'm really hoping that the West is going to help us, but it's just a hope. I don't think it's, politically tenable for them to do it. I'm just kind of like, very tense right now. I check the news and, when I see that we're getting ammunition, it makes me really happy. I'm like, we need more ammunition. We need the fighter jets. Like when I saw that the US decided not to give us the fighter jets, I was just devastated, like little things like this, make me happy, like more ammunition, more jets, because we really need to fight them off. And unfortunately, I just think, like Andrea said, he'll just keep advancing, and who knows when it's going to be over, which makes it very unfortunate for people in Ukraine, because the casualties will keep growing. We'll keep fighting. We won't capitulate. I talked to my dad today. I said, well, what if we just, what if we give in? We just, surrender. Will he leave us alone? And he said, are you crazy? Nobody's going to surrender. Even if Zelensky, our president, surrenders, people will turn against him. The army will turn against him. We are prepared to fight. There is no surrender. This is not even possible. So my dad, who is not, he used to be not very patriotic. So I would rank him as a low patriot. He said, I'll go fight. This is my house. I'm not leaving. Just give me a gun and I'll go. And other people who are a lot more patriotic, they're just going to fight. Women are going to fight. They're just not going to go. I talked to my relatives. I call them. I say, hey, some of them are older. Hey, can you get out? We can get you at the Polish border. You can move to my mom's house in Italy. We can bring you to the United States somehow. And they said, no, this is our house. We're not leaving. You're just not leaving. If they want to come in and kill us here, let it be. We're not going to go anywhere. So just knowing how patriotic Ukrainians are, and they're ready to fight and ready to die, they're just not going to give up. And Putin is just going to keep advancing, and we'll keep fighting back. But how long this is going to keep going, I don't know. It's just, my fear is that it's going to keep going for a long time. And I'm really afraid that the world is going to forget about this and just move on to something else. But maybe not, because we are so close to Poland and Europe. So maybe, hopefully, the US will keep supporting us, and the EU will keep giving us weapons. And we'll just, who knows? Ukrainians are very, they're just patriotic, and they're convinced that we will win. So, and that feeling really helps you to fight. The Russians, they have no desire to be there. The soldiers have no morale. Some of them just abandoned their tanks, and we do have something to fight for. So we're not going to give up.
So two of the questions we've received are really about, I think to sum them up would be, how comparable do you think the current situation is to Germany, and Hitler prior to World War II? And to the extent that it is comparable, are there any lessons to be learned from that in terms of what might happen moving forward?
I think there is an element of comparison. You always want to be careful whenever you compare anybody to Hitler. If we're thinking about elements of the German ideology, the kind of unite all Germans under a single flag and under a single leader, that's very appropriate comparison. Because, as Lyuda said early on, the idea is to kind of recreate maybe not the Soviet Union, but the Russian Empire, the Russian Russian-speaking populations, and to protect that population. So I think you have a comparison there. I think you have a comparison in the sense that, here's a state that is willing to, violate international norms and laws to take over somebody just militarily, whether we're talking, Czechoslovakia, or I saw that question about the Anschluss, that was a non-violent takeover, but for the most part, but you have a country who's willing to do that. I think, the worst thing we can do is to, just ignore it, to go back to the irony of the Munich discussion just before the invasion, raised, of course, a variety of talks about appeasement, of just giving in to Putin in this case. And so I think that's problematic. I did notice that question about humiliation. If he loses, will he be humiliated, and will this have the same kind of effect as it did in Germany between the wars? I think one of the arguments could be that this is how we got here, is the sense in Russia, real or not, that they were humiliated. And so there's always that risk that you really just empower a vengeance-seeking type of actor.
Another question, Putin has made clear that his invasion of Ukraine primarily concerns the expansion of NATO's borders to encompass the former Soviet republics. So what is NATO's foreign policy goal in expanding NATO, and why is Russia so threatened by this expansion?
I think early on, the idea of NATO expansion. NATO, of course, is a defensive organization. That is the purpose, is collective defense. Early on, pretty much, well, not pretty much, all of the former Soviet republics were encouraged to begin a process of consideration of possibly joining. So we had the Partnership for Peace, it was called, starting in 1994. And the idea was to encourage countries to be democratic, help them build their economy, help them counter corruption, a variety of other things, with the possibility of getting to join NATO. And so in that process, when you had countries like the Baltics, Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, when you had them achieve a level of democracy and then ask to join NATO, this was kind of that natural outgrowth. And I think in part, it was to kind of reward them, so to speak, for democratizing, for stabilizing. And, you know, it was, from our point of view, it was not an element of trying to use the term again, encircle or challenge Russia. But even in the early mid-1990s, a number of scholars, practitioners, even George Kennan, who was the father of containment, was saying, hey, look, this is dangerous. This is dangerous because Russia is going to see us as an inherent threat, that this organization that was designed to counter the Soviet Union is now on their borders and is indeed surrounding part of them in Kaliningrad. And so this is going to empower nationalists. This is going to raise that question of, you know, why is NATO, why is our former enemy now coming up against our border?
Yeah, unfortunately, because, you know, some of our presidents have been corrupt throughout the history in the last 20 years, we did not become a part of NATO, even though there are many talks about Ukraine becoming a part of NATO. And, you know, to me, I know, you know, all the geopolitics behind it, but, you know, people are getting killed, civilians are getting killed. You know, why does it matter whether we are NATO and not NATO country? You know, please come and help us, you know. And everybody's afraid because Putin has nuclear powers and he's threatening to, you know, to use his nuclear weapons. And NATO is just, you know, refusing to help because, in my opinion, they're picking between like not two evils, but like, you know, what is going to happen? Like if they help Ukraine, there is a possibility of, you know, a third world war, a nuclear war. Maybe he'll just get satisfied once he captures Ukraine. And maybe, you know, in my mind, even though it might not be that, I'm thinking, well, the NATO decides to sacrifice us and, you know, for the greater good. What if, you know, he takes Ukraine and he'll just leave everybody alone and he comes down? But I don't know if he will come down. You know, there's a pattern of him invading countries, bombing cities, killing civilians, and he goes unpunished. You know, he never gets punished for what he does. He just keeps going. It's like a bully that does not receive any consequences for their action. You guys remember the Malaysian airplane that was shot down? He said it wasn't him. Of course it was him. No consequences. You know, if you don't punish for bad behavior, it's just going to keep going. So, you know, he might invade Ukraine. I don't think he'll be able to hold on to Ukraine because, you know, all the insurgencies and people fighting back. He will not be able to hold it for too long, but he might, you know, keep progressing further west, either, you know, Baltic countries, Moldova, maybe Poland. I don't think he's going to stop. So I don't think it's a smart decision for NATO not to help us. Our president has been begging many times now, I think maybe more than 10 times now, to please deploy air defense systems because Ukrainian aviation is in a very poor shape and we're being bombarded and hit with missiles from the sky. So he just was begging NATO to deploy the defense systems, which would mean that, you know, the fighter jets have to go into the sky and push off the Russian fighter jets off. I don't know the military details behind that, but NATO is refusing and the US is refusing. We were asking for fighter jets because we can give them to Ukrainian pilots who could deploy them and, you know, help protect the sky. But US is refusing, though Poland has agreed, but now US is refusing. So I feel like NATO is trying to help us with weapons, but they don't want to get involved just because they're afraid of, starting something bigger. And in my mind, I feel like we're just going to be sacrificed for the greater good. Maybe he'll stop, but I don't think he will.
I'm going to read a question from the chat. So considering all the media news coverage about Ukraine, and from the perspective of someone that has a close friend currently in Kiev saying that the media are hard to trust, do you have any recommendations for news sources and coverage of what is happening on a daily basis that is not biased?
I read everything. I read CNN, Fox News, BBC News. I read Ukrainian news because I can understand. I speak Ukrainian, so for me it's easy to find Ukrainian channels to find the information. I talk to people on the ground in different cities. In my mind, the portrayal we get in the United States is accurate. There are some people that I'm talking, very few people, who are saying something completely different. And I'm saying that these are the minority, 95, 99% of people see what is truly going on. There are some, very few, that are just twisting the situation. I heard from somebody who is a professor in the United States in a different liberal arts college. She said that her family is in Mariupol and they are surrounded. So she texted me and she said, President Zelensky needs to stop this war and he needs to start negotiating. I said, it's not the President Zelensky who started the war. Putin needs to leave us alone. So in her mind, we need to negotiate with Russians and we need to, it's the fault of Zelensky for continuing this war. It's the fault of the United States for supplying the weapons. And it's the fault of NATO for helping us because we need to finally negotiate and she's for peace. Well, that's not the position I have. And that's not the position that 95% of Ukrainians have. So she sees us this way. Another person I talked to yesterday is also, has, similar opinion. And she's saying, well, I don't know which side to believe, which side not to believe, who is to blame. I said, well, this is pretty clear who is to blame. The Russia has attacked us. They're killing our children and civilians. I don't know what kind of conspiracy theories I'm trying to, believe in. But to me, the situation is pretty clear. And again, I'm not only reading Ukrainian news or American news. I'm talking to real people and, people in the West, people in the East. I'm on the phone all day long, calling, checking in every couple of hours, how the things going on. So I trust what I see. I think it's pretty accurate. While the minority, very small minority, believes in conspiracy theories and something completely different.
Yeah, I think the American news media is by and large doing well. So, NPR is awesome. Major news channels, I'm reading Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, New York Times. I read Al Jazeera, that has great news. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty is a great site online. BBC again is a good one. I also spend personally a bunch of time on think tanks, CSIS, CNA, a variety of acronyms about security stuff, because that's kind of my focus. And so, and a lot of the information is matching. There are slight discrepancies, but it's across those kind of sources pretty consistent in its take. And so I think a lot of the information you're getting from the mainstream media here is as accurate as you can get in a war situation.
I'll just say too,
sorry to interrupt you, but what people see in Russia is complete opposite. When they show that, a house or the apartment complex is being bombed by Russian soldiers, they show the same footage, but they're saying it's the Ukrainian soldiers hitting the residential areas. So basically the same footage, but different explanation.
I was just going to add, I've thought The Guardian has been pretty good, especially in terms of the European response. There's been far more detail in that than I've seen elsewhere. How likely is a popular uprising in Russia, given the effect of the sanctions are already having on the general public? And if there was such an uprising, how likely would it be to succeed?
I don't think it's very likely. For two reasons. Number one, a lot of the information people are getting is again skewed, and so they're getting a very different story. Number two, there have been, I think it was like 14,000 arrests already of protesters within Russia, and so that is it doesn't necessarily prevent an uprising, but it definitely limits the ability of people to merge and protest. I also don't think it's going to be over, even if you did have mass protests in Moscow and St. Petersburg, I don't think that's going to shift the government. So I would like to see the population, be able to successfully pressure the government to change its position, but I'm not sure it can.
Yeah, people are just afraid in Russia. They just been brainwashed, afraid to come out on the streets. When I talk to people from Russia, I try to call whoever I can or text whoever I can just to spread the awareness so they know what's going on. I just send photos, footage. Some are blocking me. Some are responding, yeah, we know, but we are scared. There's nothing we can do. So I don't think there will be an uprising just because historically Russians have just, have sat at home. They did not, come out on the streets to protest in masses like we did in Ukraine. In Ukraine, like Andrea, you mentioned all those revolutions and the civil protests. When I was living in Ukraine, I was part of the Orange Revolution, and we, participated in riots with other students, and not riots, but protests, protesting against the unfair elections. So I've seen these protests in Ukraine, and I know that they're powerful and they could sway the situation and uproot the government, but I've never seen anything like this in Russia. And that's one of the fears that Putin has. In Ukraine, if something is going wrong, we're coming out and we're changing things. In Russia, people are just quiet. They just sit at home and take whatever the media tells them.
I'm going to combine two questions here. One is where and how far will the West go, both militarily and economically, to end this conflict? And the second is, what are some reasonable expectations in terms of consequences for Russia's various violations of international law?
I think that we are seeing, barring Russia going into a NATO country, probably the limit of what we're doing, in the sense that we might tighten sanctions even more. So there may be some more economic sanctions. We are going to continue to filter in weaponry. So that includes anti-tank, anti-aircraft, obviously small arms and the like. But I don't think you're going to see the no-fly zone. So American pilots, NATO pilots over at the territory of Ukraine. I don't think you're going to see soldiers on the ground, boots on the ground. So I think in many ways what you are seeing right now, I expect it to continue, maybe intensify a little bit more in terms of volume of equipment being sent, in terms of level of sanctions, but I don't think we're going to go much beyond that.
Yeah, I don't think economic sanctions are severe enough, even though they're saying on the news they have been like the toughest ever. I don't think they're severe enough, from my personal opinion. For instance, you guys have heard about the SWIFT system, which is the messaging system that banks use, and it was a big deal when the US and EU decided to disconnect Russia from SWIFT. But it turns out it's only seven banks, and there are like 333 banks in Russia. Yeah, some of those seven banks are big banks, but still, it's a very small fraction of all the banks in Russia. And also the SWIFT system carefully avoids any transactions concerning gas and oil. So I feel like it's just kind of, dust in the air. We're doing something, we're, disconnecting the SWIFT, but really we're just doing whatever is convenient economically for us. So I don't think it's severe. The sanctions on Russian oligarchs, I don't think they're severe enough because, just knowing how the system works in former Soviet Union countries, these people were expecting it a long time in advance, and they have parked their wealth all around the world. And, it's like, if I'm rich, I'm not holding on to my wealth. I'm just spreading it out. My friends will be holding some of it, my family will be holding some of it. So I don't think like targeting those people actually does any good, maybe slightly, but not much. I think the biggest sanction so far has been the freeze of assets of the Russian National Bank, or the freeze of the foreign assets, because now they cannot, support their currency. But I'm very pleased that many private companies are exiting Russia. So that's going to put more squeeze on Russian population. But yeah, I don't think the economic sanctions are going far enough. And in the meanwhile, people are dying, and women are dying, and children dying, soldiers are dying. Yes, sanctions will have a big negative impact on Russian economy, but they're not going to have it immediately. It's going to take some time. And in the meanwhile, we are fighting for our lives, and I'm not sure how much longer. So I am, I'm really hoping for the no-fly zone, but I know probably it's not going to happen. I'm hoping for fighter jets. I don't know if that's going to happen. I mean, I'm grateful for all the ammunition that we're getting from the US. And, one of the reasons that we are just standing against Russian army and, being so successful so far is just because we're having all the courage to fight, in addition to the ammunition that we're getting. If we had no support from the West, I don't know how we would be fighting off. But it's really helpful to have all the ammunition, the missiles, the arms, whatever they're bringing us. It's really helpful. But I'm not, I'm not convinced that the sanctions are strong enough. I was happy to see US finally agreeing to ban imports of Russian gas. But I don't know, EU would never do that just because they rely on Russian gas so much. And Russian gas is going across the Ukraine to EU countries. Like, we're fighting for our lives, and they're buying Russian gas and paying money for it. So I don't know. It's really, to me, it's really tragic situation. I feel like we need more help. We're begging for help. Our president is begging for help, but it's just not coming fast enough. Even though we are grateful for everything EU has done and everything that NATO and the US has done, I feel we need more help, just because we're, so unprepared to fight. We don't have a strong army, and we're just so much smaller.
I'm just going to jump in and actually answer the second question about human rights and will there be quote unquote justice? Probably not. The only mechanism in the international system to try individuals for human rights abuses, there are European courts of human rights as well, but is really the International Criminal Court. And the challenge is getting to Russia to extradite any individuals who may be under indictment. And so unless Russia were willing to, ship Putin off to the ICC, Putin would not face any charges. There is a precedent of that possibility that, Sudan, after ousting al-Bashir, talked about extraditing him. And so there's the possibility, if there is a overthrow of the government, that Putin could face such justice. But otherwise, it would be unlikely.
So real quick, just speaking about the West's response, Luda mentioned a couple times, I think, that, Putin very well could move beyond the Ukraine at some point to the Baltic nations. Do you think the West's response would change if that were the case?
We're going to war with Russia if he crosses into the Baltics, both because they are NATO states, and both we and NATO have made it clear that we will defend NATO members. We will uphold Article 5, and because the Western NATO members, and that includes the United States, that includes Canada, but also the UK, Germany, France, etc., have troops in the Baltics and Poland. And so they would almost immediately come under Russian attack. And so, yeah, that would result in war with Russia. I say that with about 95% confidence.
So we are quickly running out of time. There is one question I want to get to, I think is important for everyone here, which is how can the people who are here participating in this today and others in a position outside the Ukraine best support the needs of those remaining in the Ukraine? And the question notes that monetary donations could be questionable considering potential Russian influence.
I think what we're doing today is great. I think spreading the awareness so people know all around the United States, all around the world as to what's going on in Ukraine. I think donations are great. There are so many great organizations. I don't think they're questionable. I think many organizations are very, very reputable, like UNICEF, Red Cross, World Kitchen. There are many. I can try to find links. There are direct accounts to National Bank of Ukraine with the proceeds going to Ukrainian army. There are some small local charities that I'm aware about that are doing a great job helping refugees, women and children, which also have international accounts and receive money. So there are a couple of organizations that I can vouch for right there on the ground. But things like UNICEF, Red Cross, World Kitchen are also reputable international organizations that will be helping Ukraine. Things people have been, you guys might have heard that people have been booking rooms on Airbnb in Ukraine, in Kiev and other cities. And of course, not showing up, but just making sure that the hosts get some financial support. People have been buying things on Etsy because many of the Ukrainian artists and sellers are based in Ukraine. So they've been buying items and not expecting those items to be shipped. So these are some of the efforts that I have seen people trying to engage in order to help Ukraine. But, local church in Shamokin, Ukrainian church in Shamokin is collecting donations. They're buying bulletproof vests and helmets. I'm making local operation where I'm going to be sending money to help refugees in my hometown and my local battalion. So there are some small efforts all around, even in our area, in places like Shamokin, Mount Carmel, but there are big international organizations that are also very reputable, and I would not hesitate to donate to those.
We have a lot of questions. I'm just scrolling through these. What do you think do you think that there might be an actual possibility that Russia would deploy nuclear weapons against Ukraine?
Unlikely, but I wouldn't rule it out. I think it's very unlikely. There would be great costs politically, perhaps militarily, definitely economically to Russia. I think this would, perhaps risk relations with China, because this is kind of beyond the pale in a lot of political behavior, security behavior, but I can't rule that out.
I'd like to point out that prior to 1994, Ukraine had nuclear weapons, but we gave them up. And as a part of the agreement of us giving up the weapons, we wanted to be ensured that if we are attacked, that we're not going to be attacked by Russia or the United States, but if we are attacked, we're going to be protected. And of course, we are not. So we don't have nuclear weapons anymore. And we are not getting help from NATO and the EU, unfortunately.
There is a note in the chat that I want to read for everyone, which is that the Johnson Center here on the SU campus is going to be supporting the Shamokin Church that Luda mentioned with an upcoming supply drive on campus. So students, faculty, staff, anyone on campus, please do look out for that. We are running out of time. Are you both okay if we go a few minutes over? Rick, can we go a few minutes over? Or okay. So, obviously we understand for anybody that does need to go, but we are going to keep answering questions for a little while. And again, we appreciate everyone that's come to participate in this. So please discuss Russian oil, gas, and wheat. To what extent can the European Union cut back in oil and gas now, and how long to replace it from other sources? Spring is coming, and I think the EU, Germany has only a few months supply. And obviously, Luda, you referenced this in terms of the Germans making the decision to still purchase oil and gas.
Yeah, so I was grateful that the US decided to abandon Russian gas and oil, but it's only 8%, a very small fraction that we buy from them. When it comes to countries like Hungary, Germany, they buy a good chunk. I don't know exact numbers, but maybe like 25, 30%. So they rely on Russian gas. And I think cutting that much off is not tenable for them. So, I mean, I'm praying and I'm hoping that they will finally decide to stop purchasing and importing it. But I just don't think it's going to happen. Just thinking how much those countries depend on them and how hard it would be within a short period of time to switch to alternative sources of energy, which now makes me think that, the US and Russia should have been more aggressive about pursuing green energy sources. Because, if that was the case, we would not need to rely so much on Russian oil.
Yeah, it will take a while. The demand for gas will decrease in Europe, of natural gas will decrease as it warms, because that's primarily a heating technique. But the oil requirements will remain. And of course, that's a global factor as well. So, the need for oil worldwide continues. For good or bad. There are alternatives for natural gas. If we're getting natural gas to Europe, the United States produces a lot, but it will take a while to build the facilities to be able to bring liquid natural gas carriers, ships in, and then get the gas into people's homes. So there is a timeline there. The wheat issue is less of a concern for the Europeans and the Americans, but a greater concern for the developing world. Parts of the Middle East, Egypt, countries in Africa get a significant amount of wheat, not just from Russia, but also Ukraine. And so food prices for a lot of those countries are going to shoot up pretty much by default. And so those are additional challenges in trying to deal with the fallout, for lack of a better word, of that, of this conflict.
What do you think of the situation regarding Brittany Grenier, the WNBA player? And I apologize if I got that name wrong just now, pronunciation.
Russia has used detention of people as a political tool before. I do not know whether she had the hashish oil that's what the news reported that she was being detained for. But Russia has in recent years even grabbed Americans and others and held them kind of as a political tool to try to gain some leverage, whether it be to get an individual in the West who was arrested for something, or to just try to apply a bit more pressure. So, it might be just a standard criminal activity. It might be a political activity by the government. So I don't know.
What do you think might happen to President Zelensky?
Well, right now there have been many attempts to kill him. According to Ukrainian media, it's been 10 attempts at this time, but they didn't, materialize, which is great. The U.S. has offered for him to come to the United States and become a president in exile. He refused. And I think this is great for the morale of the army and the morale of the Ukrainian people. I'm truly hoping that he will stay with us because, again, this, supports the morale of the Ukrainians. Because if he leaves, we need our leader. So my hope that he will stay and, keep fighting and, keep ensuring that he survives whatever assassinations are ongoing.
Okay, well, we are past time now. I do want to give you each a chance just to offer any concluding remarks or any other information you might like to offer for everyone.
Okay, I'll go first so we can
go ahead. Yeah.
with Luda. I think it's, this is one of those, events that is on multiple levels extremely important. Obviously on the personal level for Ukrainians, for Ukrainian families abroad, this is devastating. It is also something that is challenging the international system as we've seen it since the end of the Cold War, and even in some ways since World War II. The idea that you should not just invade a neighbor because you want their territory. And so, this is it's frankly kind of a scary time, I think, and it's important to recognize that, but it's also a really important time to, think about confronting the challenge that we have right now to democracy and liberalism, to the issues that we as Americans, that the Ukrainians are in many ways standing for. And so I think it's important to think about this as both this localized conflict and the horrors that is leading to, but also those broader ramifications.
Yeah, to me personally, this is unimaginable tragedy. You know, in my calendar now, I count the days of the war instead of the days of the day. And, you know, I never thought something like this will happen. I mean, I remember the war stories of my grandmother because she lived through the Second World War. And her house was located right at the front of the fighting. So she would tell me about the dead bodies laying in her yard and about their evacuation efforts where they have to walk for miles with her cow and her, you know, her animals. And it was just, you know, so like interesting to me from the historical perspective. You know, once in a while I would even find like a bullet on the ground and like, wow, this is super interesting. To me, it was just, you know, part of the history. I never thought anything like this could even happen again. So to me, it's astounding, you know, unimaginable that something like this is happening in my own country in the 21st century. I just like, I'm still in the state of shock. Like every day I'm in a state of shock. I don't believe this is true, but this is true. So, you know, I want you to, as Andrea was saying, you know, our world is so interconnected. Things that are happening around the world are touching all of us. And, you know, especially in Ukraine, you know, we're fighting for our land, but we are also fighting for, you know, for what's right. Because what Putin is doing is not right. It's not fair. You know, we are fighting for what's right. We are fighting for what is just. We are fighting for democracy. You know, we are fighting against tyranny. So we're showing the world, you know, how you should fight for your freedoms. You know, freedom is not free. You have to fight for it. You know, you might need to die for it. So, you know, to me, it's very personal, but I also believe that, you know, the rest of the world should see how hard we are fighting and, you know, they should support us and help us. And, you know, like I said, we are not only fighting for ourselves, we're fighting for what's right.
Hey, I think I'm going to end by just reading a comment from Betsy Verhoeven, the interim dean of humanities and arts, which is, Luda, I can't imagine how hard it must be to watch this happening with so many people you care about affected and your care for your home. And she says to both speakers, I'm so grateful for your insight and providing this context that we wouldn't otherwise have. There's a lot of comments like that coming through the chat now. And so I'll just end by thanking you both for being willing to do this and to share your expertise and your experiences and really help all of us better understand what's happening right now in Ukraine. Thanks to everyone that is still there for tuning in with us, for participating in the panel. We greatly appreciate you're doing this, and we hope that everyone has a good evening.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a good night. Thank you.